Thank you to everyone who's joined us today. I appreciate your time to come and join Genius Boards. I am Sharon Constançon, CEO of Genius Boards, and I thank you very much for being here with us. Thank you. We are going to be talking about governance subjects. We are running a series of events with governance professionals who are leading edge in their knowledge, engineering of how to improve good governance. So please stay with us for the series of events that will go on for a couple of months still. So if you have any questions, please could you put them into the Q&A function, and I'll pick those up and ask Andrew his opinion on those, maybe potentially give you some answers myself in the process of the hour that we are together. So thank you very much for joining us once again. Looking forward to having a good session. And I would like to now introduce my guest, Andrew Kakabadse, who is the professor at Henley Business School for Governance. And I've known him for many years. We were just discussing earlier, picking up some notes and conversations from 10 odd years ago. So it's wonderful to spend some time together with you, Andrew. Thank you for being my guest. And Andrew is an author, he's a professor, he is conference speaker many times. Many people call upon him to speak and to share his profound knowledge in the governance space. So you're in for a treat, guys. I'm looking forward to it. I enjoy having these kind of debates with Andrew because he's an extremely clever individual. We're going to cover three topics today as defined on the cover slide. We're going to talk about decision making in the boardroom environment, conflict management, particularly in the boardroom environment or board and executive environment. And then we're going to talk about quotients, which right now probably means absolutely nothing, but it will become informative and valuable once we get to that part of the session. So picking up, Andrew, first of all, I'm not going to go straight into decision making. Please just tell us a little bit about yourself, your career, your passion for governance. Let's hear about the man.
Sharon, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Your words are very kind, very pleasant. Thank you and it's good to have known you for so long. Me, the person, I never started in governance or leadership. I started with environment. Then I went into community services. I was a mental health officer, childcare officer in the docks of Liverpool and in Chelsea. From that, I worked with government, the restructuring of government in Scotland. From that to the private sector, believe it or not, I was a consultant to a fish canning factory in Venezuela, of all of the things. Why fish canning in Venezuela? Who knows? And then went into security, military and government, and then finally became an academic. So I went through a number of disciplines, and possibly the most informative discipline of all was the one in psychiatry, because I had to go into depth as to how does engagement work and will it work, and how can we manufacture engagement for people who are finding it exceptionally difficult to do so, like people who have got schizophrenia and other problems. So my career, which ended up in the governance of institutions, really began right at the bottom of the organization, in the community. And in many ways, that's how I worked my way up. Can you hear me? I can't hear you.
I can hear you. Sorry, Andrew.
Lovely.
Yes. Thank you very much for that insight. I just learned a few more things about you. So really interesting. And it's interesting, the correlation between the kinds of things we're going to be talking about today is it's about the human brain. How does the brain work? How do our emotions work? How do we manage our bias? How do we manage our territory, our ego? And these are all the things that get in the way of so many of good, competent people's ability to work within a team. So when I lecture in boardroom dynamics, so follow a bit of an academic side like you do now and then. And we often look at why is it so difficult? Why is boardroom dynamics and having the ability to make decisions. Why is it so difficult? And one of the things in my research that I have picked up is that as soon as there is a human, that will be, and I use the word impacted, by the decision, the ability to make that decision seems to instantly fail. I don't want to upset so-and-so. I don't want to be seen to take the difficult decision against so-and-so. They won't like me anymore if I do this. I'll be hurting an individual, or I'll be embarrassing myself, or those kind of things is the emotional response we tend to see. So it definitely does impact the way people respond in the decision-making space. So I just wanted to quickly just cover from a theoretical point of view. I looked at the bias codex. It's 183 biases, and I lost the will to live very, very quickly. So what I did is I picked 27 odd of these biases and put them into 6 business categories, likely business categories that would reflect what they were. So if we look at the easy answer influences, it's groupthink, expectation bias, projection bias, etc. If we look at personal influences, metacognitive bias, naivety bias, good feelings, the confirmation bias, I think we'll all get an understanding of what it is I'm referring to. So we picked those 27 relevant ones, and then realized that the key thing that is missing in that process is diversity. So how does diversity and the existence of gender, age, social ethnicity impact the way we make decisions as well, which gives us the 7 business bias themes that we have created, which makes it easier for people to consider than trying to look at the 183 odd on the codex. We also then, in our research, have tried to understand what impacts people's thinking. How do we, as a director, become influenced? What are the things that impact us? Now, some of these we're going to cover today, but I just wanted to put the model up so that it can be understood. We've talked about biases in the right-hand quadrant. There's also the personal agenda, or the business agenda, or the sustainability agenda, whatever agenda might also exist. Quotients we're going to cover in a moment. Diversities, we're talking about that as being part of the bias influence. And the very important aspect of being able to influence the director is whether they're empowered. Are they listened to? Do they challenge? Do they step up to the mark? And then we have things like thinking styles, people who can think on their feet or not, personalities and behaviors. Do I throw a temper tantrum when things don't go my way? And then their background, their experience, the skills, the know-how that they bring to the equation. So these are the things that we consider the influences that impact a individual in the way they behave in the boardroom environment. So just from our perspective, just having a chat about decision making, do you want to just give some of your initial insights on the complexity of decision making?
Certainly. And Sharon, may I say your model follows a very rich history, because if we were living 3,500 years ago in Mesopotamia, you would have an audience. Because that was one of the first governance initiatives, which was based on 2 things. One of them you said, it's once the person walks in the room, the complications start. And the second is, how do we get an order and a discipline without restricting people at the same time? So we've had 3,500 years, and you would have thought we would have learned. We have. The problem is, in different contexts, the decision process varies. What are the concerns with decisions? First, are we really dealing with evidence? And you'll be amazed to see how many decisions are made not essentially on an evidence base, but on something else called an interest base. I am representing an interest. I have a self-interest. I have a view on this context. I don't want this context to change because I like it. And so you've got a continual balance between the evidence is suggesting one direction, and then your judgment is suggesting whether you want to take that direction or not. Then you have something that you said yourself, ego. That can go into it, but ego actually, funnily enough, we found has a function because the other side of ego, especially for people at the top, is they must have self-confidence.
Mm-hmm.
And without that self-confidence, no decision can be effectively made or carried through. It may be made, but not carried through. So how do you then balance the domination of your persona, whilst at the same time indicating that you have a resilience that really can see through challenges? And those are the complications: the evidence, the judgment, and the context, and how you're going to navigate your way through that. What do we have then with more than one person in the room? Multiple viewpoints on that navigation process.
Yes. And those multiple navigation points, you will, I'm sure you find that a lot of that comes down to the character and the determination somebody has to get some decision passed. For example, I have often seen a CEO who's looking to process an investment into a new business, grow the company in a certain way, or in one case I came across to create an investment into a fund that was of his choice. And no amount of debate, discussion, ideas were considered by that individual, because all they wanted was their answer, their desired outcome. So the discussion broke down completely, because every time that person had heard another view, they just went back to, I need this to be an outcome. I don't want to be embarrassed by this not being the way I want it.
Yeah, very true. We take one of the examples, which was the biggest corporate collapse in the UK, Marconi. We have the situation that we had the situation that you're outlining. And I think one of the principal components of that collapse was the finance director. Mm-hmm. But that person had a view on how Marconi would spend its monetary capacity to grow, and identified a number of outlets in the US, and they wanted to acquire them and merge them with Marconi. Now, there were different points of view that was not going to work. This happened, that was not going to work. And certainly for one or two of the acquisitions, it didn't. The interesting question is, why was there one direction taken when there was a buildup of evidence that it may not work? To be fair to the finance director, many people have done what he did was, I've got multiple inputs coming to me. Many of them are probably irreconcilable. If you don't have the confidence to see what the outcome will be, and you start taking into account too many issues, you'll never be able to achieve. Then there is the other balance, which says, my dear friend, you're listening to the evidence, you're not listening to the evidence that says you're going wrong. And having that balance is really quite interesting. And that's where you bring in the personal component into the decision process, which is at least the tolerance and the patience to listen. Mm-hmm. Another word would be humility. How you balance a self-confidence with humility, whilst judging evidence that's coming from multiple angles, some of which is only to promote somebody else's self-interest, is the interesting question, which makes, if you like, the top-level management board or C-suite and the decision process a really demanding intellectual process. You do have to be smart for that job. And the high IQ component is very important.
And to your point on high IQ is needed to be able to have your facts, have your evidence, know what the truth is, or know what the evidence. But you also need a high degree of EQ, in my opinion, so that you can phrase your argument such that the audience is going to listen, hear, respect, understand what you're saying, rather than being IQ only and telling the facts and nobody's listening.
Very true. That sensitivity to that audience in that context, and your personal capacity to emotionally adjust to different audiences is fine. I found the EQ component vital, but funnily enough, at senior levels, the EQ component almost fell into disuse, is what I found. And something else came up, which I call the PQ, or political component, which is EQ, but with an agenda. So if we take the traditional EQ definition of I listen to you, you listen to me, I go into your space, you go into mine, it is a sharing experience. But at that senior level, I found less sharing and far more sharp negotiation. You still needed the same EQ skills, but they were going to be handled in a particular way. And if I were to put my finger on why do so many good people either not make it or fail in that top job, it actually was the mental migration from EQ to PQ. And they couldn't quite understand that something which you might on the one hand call manipulation, or on the other hand called sharp negotiation, was now more vital than the genuine honesty behind EQ. But the skill is there. It's how it's used at that senior level.
Very interesting. One of the things that we also look at is teaching directors to recognize that they are biased. First of all, if they think they're not, they've got the worst of the biases, metacognitive bias. But making sure they understand that human nature is biased to begin with. And if receiving that piece of information and then being able to navel gaze in an honest, transparent manner will make us far more capable of tripwiring the kind of bias we might be falling into. And a very simple one, and I'm going to simplify 12 down to 3. Ask yourself, are you being biased? Ask the person delivering it whether they have an agenda, a bias, or a need, and then looking at the facts of the project. So looking at it at 3 levels. And the other, one of the other tripwire ones, which comes from another model, which is quite nice, is actually take yourself into the future and look back, or look from above and see, will this pass the sniff test of being a good decision in the future? And a lot of people, unfortunately, don't have the EQ ability to look from the future backwards. Some can only be in the moment. So it's a certain skill to achieve that latter one I mentioned.
There is. And it is a subtle skill. And perhaps one of the things to overcome is, do I care or not? I've seen many executives who, even with the wrong data, have the conviction that you just aren't catching up sufficiently to my mindset, and I will be proven right in 2 years, 3 years, but it's just we're on a bit of a bumpy ride now. So in a sense, do I care whether what you're telling me is relevant or not, because my mind is fixated over here? And that for me has been a major concern. How does a person like that learn? Is it through feedback? Is it through what you and I do, the coaching, the mentoring, the care and support? And I found, yes, up to a point, but for many people, the real learning is through pain.
Getting it wrong.
Collapsed, until it's gone wrong, until you are publicly accountable for this type of situation, you're not going to learn. When I look back at some of the corporate collapses where I was involved, tried to help, perhaps didn't help very well, such as Marconi and HBOS and 1 or 2 others, to this day, some of those top executives are in denial. It was not me, it was all those around me. And they will give you chapter and detail of meetings or a particular decision made at a meeting 15, 17, 22 years ago, as if it was happening to them right now. And the denial process is really that strong. It really is.
Incredible.
It's absolutely incredible how an individual cannot absorb some sort of information, evidence or emotional, which will help them rethink what they're doing. And they need to narrow down and focus in such a way that that's the only way they can move forward. So we have a very interesting and serious problem here, which only few have managed to find a way through, because you have the element of control of outcomes. I must have this outcome, and then let me search for the evidence that provides me with that way forward. Even
validates mine.
Do the opposite. Yeah.
It's quite incredible. I actually, to counter your story, I've come across chairman and a director in the last 2 years who give me some hope for the future, where in both occasions they'd been involved where the board had made the wrong decision. First of all, my advice to anyone, if you've made the wrong decision, accept it, admit it, fix it, get the right decision in as quickly as possible. Don't go through that bias factor of, well, we've already on this road, we have to make it work. No, you don't. Stop, fire break, get out, start again. Reset the clock and make the right decision, because invariably that's a lot cheaper than pursuing the wrong decision. But in this case, the director said, if I'd known then what I know now about governance, I would never have made the decision we made. Another one was a chairman, and he said, over the years, I've learned a lot. And looking back, I know if I was faced with that same situation, I would handle it very differently. So there are two senior executives that I've come across that have learned, but they don't at the time, and for many years probably, would be in the situation you are saying, that denial. But that was two individuals that give me the hope of life, that they did move to another place and recognize, through probably making some better decisions in their business career, recognize the inappropriateness of the first one, or the one referenced.
And funnily enough, despite what I said, I share your hope, because I equally have come across senior executives who, whatever decision they made, you could see even at the time they were making a decision that was inappropriate, they still had a learning mindset. Mm-hmm. And that learning mindset is critical. What I found with that is it's not just an awareness. You read a few books, you talk to people, you go to various dinners, and you learn by according to who's sitting next to you. It is a discipline. You discipline yourself to continually update, to learn, to be informed, to create an environment with your colleagues where there is challenge taking place, even if not of you, but of a challenge taking place in that context, in that meeting. Where we have that, we have a great deal of hope. Where you don't see that learning mindset being brought in and almost dug deep into the conversational processes in the boardroom or the C-suite, we have the alternative, which is denial.
And we have that denial curve, that learning curve, where you go into denial or anger, denial, and then you learn and you come out the other side. What I hear you saying is some people don't reach the bottom, least of all come up the other side.
Yeah, exactly.
I just want to move now into conflict management. And with a bit of luck, the cooperation will come to me here. There we go. So one of the things that you have done a lot of work on, and you have published a paper on conflict and tension in the boardroom, and I identify the cover there and some of the very valuable chapters that you cover in this work that you did with ICSA, now known as the Chartered Governance Institute. And the things that company secretaries today, directors today, and chairmen today should be understanding, that difference between constructive tension, and therefore we are getting to the right decision because we are giving and taking in this conversation, but we don't necessarily agree at the beginning, but we come to a mutual place through constructive tension. And hopefully you haven't got too many of them in the argument, because then we'll go nowhere. And then the conflict aspect, where I'm right, you're wrong, kind of mental capacity. So maybe tell us a little bit about this work, the research, and the value that this work has brought to the business world.
Thank you. The work started long before the ICSA, mm-hmm. and it began with a world survey on boards and what was happening there. And the very first statistic to have come to the surface is that conflict, tension, depending on the degree, is inherent in boards. The reason is that boards are the last port of call of any issues that remain unaddressed in the organization. If we didn't have boards, we would have our courts so full we couldn't function. So here is an entity whose prime aim is to provide an oversight. The oversight of these assets underneath my care. I don't have executive authority. I have to influence them. And principally, all I have is the two levers of compliance on the one hand, which is a judicial process, and stewardship, which is a personal process of how I would like to see these assets positioned. In that, in every country we went to, there was a difference of view on one or two fundamentals. First, competitive advantage. Why should I on this board agree with you on what is the competitive advantage of this entity? The second, differentiation. We've got to somehow make ourselves different, better, or show some sort of leaning which other people don't have, and that has to become public in the marketplace. The overall statistic across what was now 47 countries was 34% of boards and top teams are continually divided on mission, vision, strategy.
34%.
34%. And if we go to not a company, the federal government of Australia, we were asked to analyze the federal government of Australia, and there the statistic was 56%. And just to put it into real life, we would have top civil servants and ministers going into a meeting, all agreeing a way forward, and 56% would go out of the meeting and do something deliberately different. Now, why? It seemed almost immature. It wasn't. It was a genuine difference of view as to what we're supposed to be doing over here. And until we had found some way to work our way through those misalignments, we would not be able to reach some sort of meaningful conclusion. The tension part was the working through, and in many ways healthy. The conflict part was when we've taken fixed positions and we can't work our way through. We've almost got to bulldoze you out of the way, or you bulldoze me out of the way in order to reach that meaningful conclusion. The interest with the ICSA was the one figure that in many ways, right across the world, nobody had really taken that much notice of. The company secretary was absolutely vital. The one person in charge of data, how we're putting the board pack together, the sentiments of the board directors, how the chair feels about the CEO, the company secretary themselves, for their performance being analyzed by either finance director, CEO, or legal counsel, but reporting to the chair for business. How that individual now created a way forward through some of these almost irreconcilable conflicts and turned the world into tension. So tension, not bad. Conflict, not good. But tension, we cannot escape because we're human and we have a view on how to move forward.
And if
you could even find that in
tension,
universities.
Wouldn't we have groupthink?
And the problem, if we don't, yes, we could have the alternative, which is groupthink. So it's a constant balance. And I think the good board director is someone who is conscious of how they are going to define the term oversight. I've come onto this board, I've listened to everybody. My conclusion perhaps is somewhat different to some of my colleagues on the board. So what does oversight mean for me? And coming to that conclusion meaningfully means that you've also come to a conclusion about your colleagues' capacities on that board. Now, how do we work our way forward? The smart director through a stewardship mindset. The not so smart director with a more upfront, almost confrontational mindset, which doesn't work. And what am I finding on boards today? Because that life is difficult. I'm finding the compensation is to over-rely on compliance, knowing that it cannot work.
So just explain that. We over-rely as a director on compliance rather than put my head over the parapet and debate it. Is that what I'm saying?
Basically, yeah. We have boards, whether it's police, business, health, with so many compliance demands on them. It is easier in a strange sense to deal with those compliance demands at the expense of other sensitivities there.
I get what you're saying.
And directors know it. And that is the tragic part. Directors know it. Directors know, in the one sense, they're not derelict in their duties. They're not standing up for what they really believe in and what should happen on the board. And so the situation slowly drifts into, we don't discuss the tensions, we don't discuss the conflicts, we don't discuss what are the alternatives that we've really got in this marketplace. And as long as we comply, somehow things will be okay. Well, they won't.
They won't, because you might match a spreadsheet called a budget for a year or so, and thereafter, it doesn't matter how innovative the finance director is, you're going to stop matching the demands of your budget.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's not going to be sustainable.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've seen organizations where it was being very much led strategically, not, but that's the alignment, is strategically they were running the organization from a budget that was a spreadsheet on 5% growth on last year kind of thing. So yeah. Absolutely no innovation into the strategy, absolutely no innovation into what this company should be doing. In other words, what is the minimum I can put forward at spreadsheet level that will allow me to match that objective, get my long-term incentive plan payout, and I haven't had to work too hard. I haven't had to answer too many difficult questions. So you get that whole positioning quite inappropriately in an organization. And one of the interesting things I had when doing an evaluation was where the board were saying that they knew something was wrong, and they pinned it on the CEO. And because that is where it was evidencing itself. And I said, well, I'm not going to believe you until we've had a good look at what is going on throughout the executive. Very quickly transpired that the lack of stewardship, lack of doing what was the right thing for the business, that was looking after a personal agenda and protecting a personal rear end, was the finance director. And on top of that, the finance director had an influence over the CEO, which we all know is a relationship you do not want to have, influence over one over the other. They need to be absolutely independent and have a constructive tension between the two of them. The bottom line was the assets and the profitability was minus 60%,
wow.
Which hurts. It hurts in any organization. But the board couldn't see it because the person played a good game. That PQ, with the negative manipulation element of it, had them eating out of his hand.
Interestingly enough, the academic literature, which is always slow and a bit behind, is coming up with the term the psychopathic finance director. I know the CEO's been accused of being psychopathic, inhuman, and all that, but actually it's now being transferred to the finance director. And I think what you're showing is it's a very interesting phenomenon. The person accountable for all resources is now being challenged by the person accountable for all the financing of those resources.
And it's a bit of a gamekeeper-poacher situation.
It is.
And quite often, I mean, we look at the different personality types that we have and the way people respond. And we took a spider diagram, whatever they call them, and we mapped the EQ, the IQ, the PQ, all your Qs, which we'll talk about in a moment, on a map. And we mapped, then just to point out to the board why they were struggling, is we mapped the finance director on top of the marketing client-orientated NED. And we mapped the two on top of each other. And the only point of the Qs that they matched each other was looking at I can't remember which Q it was, but it was the one that was looking at doing the right thing. Ethics, the one that's most closely linked to ethics.
Yeah, the MQ.
MQ, that's one, moral quotient.
Moral quotient, yeah.
That was the only area where they showed any form of commonality.
Really?
And the coaching we had to go through was saying, you're different. See it, look at the picture. It's very evidential why you are struggling to be in the same room together. But remember, this doesn't matter. You are here for the business, not for your personal ego. And it was a massive, groundbreaking sort of moment that they had to say, well, it's not about me. But it's so subconscious. We do it about ourselves rather than what we intend to do, which is to do it for the business.
Sharon, that's a very interesting case. When you were going through that process, was there a breakthrough point where the two could at least respect having a conversation, if nothing else?
They did improve. The finance director will still to this day really struggle, but recognizes the need to think differently. Mm-hmm. The marketing person totally got the issue. The client-orientated, customer-orientated person completely got the problem and immediately switched into that PQ element you were talking about, is how do I speak so that the finance director doesn't get defensive? Yeah. How do I now engage to bring that person with me on the journey? So because that director worked really hard in respecting their differences and found a way to apply such that they could speak to each other.
Huh. So one party, in one sense, needed to be, I don't want to use the word advanced, but progress a little bit more in maturity than the other.
Yeah. And I think you often find that in a conflict tension environment, particularly a tension environment. One of them will realize, actually, I might win the war, but I don't have to win every battle, kind of mentality.
Yeah.
The other aspect is when you get into conflict and they've got their shutters up, well, you're going to struggle, whatever you try and do. But just before we go off this conflict and tension discussion, I just want to bring it back to the company secretary. I've given an example of a director. Can you give any idea of how you would coach a company secretary to be that trusted negotiator who can influence both parties to the right outcome?
What emerged was...
Sorry, it's my alarm.
Oh, okay.
It's just been fixed and now it's working.
Oh, good. What emerged from that study was equal to a study with chairmen, or chairs, I should say. And the chair's balancing capacity, which is the understanding of the markets, the understanding of the organization, the cultures, the challenges there, the acute understanding of the personalities on the board and the C-suite, and really finding that pathway was identical to the company secretary. So one of the best chairs that I've seen, Robert Swanold, Marks and Spencer's, was a former company secretary.
And not many who get that role yet. It's going to change.
It's going to change, absolutely. So the first thing I do is just basically say, do you understand how important your role is? Yeah. And do you understand that evidence suggests that in one sense, you don't have the title, but you're the second chair to this board?
Yes.
You're almost like the deputy chair.
Music to my ears.
And then a discussion really starts with, what does it take to be here? Now, part of that discussion is to bring to the surface a company secretary who is more procedural, legalized, and needs a structure. And in a sense, help them understand that that is part of their job or not, versus the one that balances that with the reality of working on this board. I have to say, with some in the discussion process, I advise them not to go for too complex a company secretary job, because the balancing is somehow beyond their reach at this moment. So they need further development. But it is essentially, number one, the message, you are a chair-like person. Number two, let's shift you slightly away from some of the training, which is compliance and procedure, and then look at what you really need to do to balance. Funnily enough, many of the company secretaries I came across were already there. Their biggest problem, they didn't have the confidence. I was really confidence building. That's what I was really doing.
That empowerment that I talked about under influence?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That empowerment is extremely critical. And what I find very rewarding now is on the qualifying program for company secretaries, their final exam is boardroom dynamics. They have absolutely got that if a company secretary is going to do the true board support company secretarial role, they have to go through all this understanding of human nature and the issues that they bring to the party without even knowing they're doing it, as directors and chairs, and looking at all the different roles. One last question. In your experience, to what extent do you see the chair CEO as a relationship of tension or a relationship of conflict?
It's both, unfortunately. And when it goes wrong, it's a relationship of conflict. Where the tension is really positive is where we've found we have two factors. The first is we think in a similar manner. That's not we agree with each other, but you can begin to see there is a mindset blending there. And the challenge, one of the other, is substantial, but positive. The second, there is an emotional link. And in the Greek word philos, meaning Greek deep friend, we have those two elements. So in a sense, we got good mates coming together, very active, and we have a great conversation. Everybody thinks we're fighting. We're not. But how many relationships were like that? 24%, if we're lucky. Not bad is there is a mindset marrying, but there's no emotional link whatsoever. Workable. The worst is, I think there's one more word left, and that is paralyzed. The worst situation is where the chair likes the CEO, but recognizes they're not good. They don't have a similar mindset. And you go into a world, unless you're very careful, of excuses. I like this guy, I relate to this person, I feel for this individual, and the real problem is I cannot face up to terminating the relationship.
Back to decision making.
Absolutely. So we go from tension to conflict, and then the worst of the lot, paralysis. And that's a bad one.
A very, very bad one. And I've seen it a number of times where that role reversal as to who actually is holding the reins between them. And the component part that to me is fundamental to getting that one to work is mutual respect.
It is.
And both those words are as critically important as the other.
Absolutely. And liking is not mutual respect.
No, not at all. Just to move on before we run out of time, we've got a couple of questions coming through. So if anybody else would like to add to our questions, please do so, and we will debate them in a moment. I want to talk about leadership quotients. Andrew has written a book on the 5 leadership quotients that are required to be a good leader, stroke chair, CEO, whatever element of grouping team that they are leading. And we have then built upon that as Genius and taken it to 11, being encompassing lots of people within the team rather than looking at the leader in its on their own. So what we've looked at is, if you look in the top 2 quadrants, you've got IQ and resilience, which are, and then you've got the 3 on the other side. Those top 5 are Andrew's leadership quotients. Cognitive intelligence, resilience quotient, EQ, moral quotient we've talked about, and the political quotient that he's talked about. So these are all the things that make us the good leader. So Andrew, given that you're the author of the book, not me, would you like to talk a little bit more to that top 2 quadrants?
Yes, certainly. How did all this research start? It started with the emphasis I was hearing on EQ, very important, but when it got to the senior levels, I was not seeing EQ in practice. So we started a study. It went through about, 11 nations. And the first outstanding quotient was the rationalization evidence-based IQ. Do you have a mindset to put together complexity of argument in such a way that it makes sense to everybody else? And then, as we've already mentioned, from EQ to PQ, it simply is the same sensitivities, but this time with finding a pathway through misalignments, and you cannot have some of the honesties in EQ. But then what stood out was the emotional strength, and that was the resilience. Do you have the emotional strength to be able to withstand challenges and pressures? And sometimes when there is no solution to the situation, you've just got to take the brunt of the criticisms or challenges being thrown at you, and that of itself is the solution. And then finally, when you do face a moral dilemma, what do you do? Do you even recognize the moral dilemma? Do you understand even your own ethical structure? How do you respond when life is uncomfortable, but you have to make choices? So that's really how the 5Qs study emerged.
When you were talking earlier about the PQ being an evolution from the EQ, if you put the moral quotient between those two, you will get the positive political quotient. If somebody doesn't have the MQ in the middle, they will become more negatively influential than positively. Just something I recognize in the way we've laid it out.
Well, very interesting, because in my studies, the MQ was the lowest scoring Q.
Really?
And by far, because we then had to, apart from the qualitative interviews we undertook, we then created questionnaires and put them through their own validation type statistics, which have turned out to be pretty good. We got a sample from China, from the US, from Europe, from the Middle East. Wow. So we really got wide samples from wide cultures, and whichever culture you went into, especially at board and C-suite, by far the MQ was the lowest. So you raised a very interesting point, Sharon. By that being so, that balancing that you're talking about is not inherently there. Mm. And why then do people, in a sense, put the MQ right at the bottom? And I think the reason is because they're dealing with resources. So when you're dealing with resources, you have to have a more short-termist mindset to at least, is there profit? Is there loss? Are there going to be costs? How do we handle this stakeholder relationship over here? How do we handle the press and media over there? And in that sense, you almost train yourself out of being in a more ethical approach, except for one group. And I couldn't believe it. It was the British civil servant. Mm-hmm. I have never seen in any part of the world, and I've dealt with civil services and private sector, I've dealt with the civil services in China, in Russia, in Germany, in France, Australia, New Zealand, even the United States. There is not one that comes up with a true belief in society. And for us, it happens to be a belief in representative democracy. This is the government that's been elected. Our belief in representative democracy is so great, we must at all costs support the minister. So that's how that logic continues. And that MQ is very high. But you know what I also found? It wasn't linked with a PQ. So the sort of Sir Humphrey, yes, minister type of things we saw on television years ago, this manipulative civil servant, actually what we found was they were EQ. They were genuinely honest, wanting to do a good job, tell the truth. High on IQ, yes, very clever people, but they were almost politically naive. So you had a moral sense, you had a genuine concern to do good. That showed itself as service. I really want to serve you. And believe you me, they were being so badly treated by the ministers, it was appalling to see.
Incredible. Well, we took your 5, and as per discussions we've had before, we built upon those and looked at some of the things that get in the way of boards. Now, I'm talking not one person, I'm talking about the collective unit. What are the types of things that stall them from making the right decisions, operating effectively and performing effectively, holding to account, stepping up, challenging all the things that we need a board to do? We came across these other 6 that we have recognized happening. The one that always worries me the most, and I see it very often, is appetite quotient. I don't have the appetite for risk, okay? I don't have the appetite to change my mind. I don't have the appetite to do anything that might reputationally affect me. I don't want to put my head over the parapet, and I don't have the appetite for standing up. All these things where a director is not giving of themselves fully or creating through discussion a decision of the lowest common denominator because they can't open their mind to the opportunity side of threat, to opportunity, and understanding that risk management is about taking opportunities, otherwise the business is going to not go anywhere anyway. The digital capacity, we do know that that is something our world is requiring. A strategic mind, what I find, and this is an interesting one, from your experience, if you had to look at the boards that you've worked at, how many people on that board are strategic in their competency?
Very, very interesting question. The moment they leave the boardroom and go to the dinner table, to their families, to their mates, superb. The moment they go into the boardroom, unfortunately, it is somehow restricted. And I still come back to the compliance sort of thinking. But strategically minded, yes. Strategically minded in the boardroom, it's a major concern.
Yeah, I am being so frequently so disappointed in how do we think bigger than the moment I'm in? How do I think for the future? How can I be fit for the future thinking for this business? And yes, I can do all the SWOT analysis as you ask me to do, but actually, have I sat down and really thought it through strategically, rather than what's the art of the possible that I have in front of me? The other one is cultural intelligence. That's sort of working with your diversities, being able to understand where other people are coming from, respect them. Transformational capacity, as we all know, boards are having to transform hugely, whether it is IT, culture, ESG, diversity, equity and inclusion. We are all having to think differently these days. The modern agenda itself, least of all the other things we used to in IT being the biggest physical one. If we don't have the ability to accept change around us, we are going to hold the board back. And how many times do I see the biggest risk in an organization is the board? Because they are handcuffing the entire business because they being too restrictive in the way that they rather let somebody fly, make a mistake, and if they're wrong for the business, there's some big decisions to make. But to hold the business back and try and control it, like I know some governments try and do, isn't the answer for corporate environment. And the other one is to bring to the board neurodiverse thinking. Find that extremely useful because a lot of us won't make that difficult people decision. Neurodiverse people say, it's fine, fire them. They don't have that same concern or logic thinking. So to have somebody with neurodiverse thinking on the board does challenge dealing with a difficult question. So those are the ones that we've put together, and I call them capabilities. Any comment or any thoughts, anything that you've seen there or recognize there?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, congratulations. It's a very interesting list to add. Secondly, the word capability, totally agree. It's not skills, it's not competence, it's are you capable of making a difference here in those particular areas? So it is me in this context that makes the difference. What I like about what you've brought here, and I'm wondering if there's a relationship, is there a relationship between the appetite quotient and the cultural intelligence?
Yes, I think there is.
What was it that you found?
If you look at your cultural intelligence, you need a degree of that, not in everybody. So does the SID have it? Does the COSEC have it? Does the chair have some of that ability to work with all these different people? The appetite quotient is, can I accept risk? Can I accept being inclusive and working with diversity and empowering diversity? That's where I see those two cross over, is through the lens of diversity. But your appetite quotient for risk, for new ideas, for change, for uncertainty, for volatility, those are all the other things that we see directors really bumping their heads because they can't put it down in a spreadsheet and therefore they don't want anything to do with it. and yet that's the real world we're working in, is change.
I totally agree. Lovely list, absolutely super research. And for me, if you can't handle the appetite quotient and the cultural intelligence bits, the others really don't function. That was my experience.
And I think you're 100% right on that one. One of the questions, because we're going to run out of time, Andrew, goodness, we obviously need another 2-3 hours to converse, but just looking at the role of the risk committee, we've talked about addressing some of these risks of making the wrong decisions, being biased, the tension and conflicts we've talked about, looking at our leadership and capabilities around the board. Is there a role for the risk committee in the space, in addition to, I see company secretary and I see the chairman and Sid as being key leaders on the things we've been talking about? But what about the risk chair?
Yes, there is a need for that. It has its limitations. If we look at risk registers and then the quality of output from the risk committees, especially in organizations that have gone wrong, they were excellent. The problem was they weren't about the real risk, which was actually in the boardroom and in the C-suite. So a risk committee does have a value in at least giving public confidence that we've looked at certain things, they've been logged down, there's been a discipline behind that, shareholders can trust that, press media can trust that. But the big problem is, can the risk committee deal with the risks that are in the boardroom and the C-suite as they are being lived? And so far, my experience is they don't.
They can't.
They can't. It's either the chair's going to do it, the company secretary may slowly meander towards it, perhaps a director more deviant and more resilient, able to stand up and raise that, can do it, but a risk committee cannot.
No. The value I see in a risk committee, looking at this little window of risks on their agenda, is if you've got a subgroup of the board that in a confidential environment can talk about what worries them, the chances are some of these issues will be raised, and therefore there's a greater awareness than if we didn't have a moment where 3 people out of the board of 7 or whatever didn't have the opportunity to chew the cud over a dinner in an informal environment, what really is worrying us about the board. And so often the conversation, it's the chair or it's the CEO, don't come up in the conversation because they never have the space to have that conversation.
Yeah. And the other thing we've got to be careful is sometimes the risk committee chair is a separate chair, sometimes not. We looked at the nominations committee, which is really looking at the future lifeblood of the organization coming in at the senior level. And the only chair that was ultimately accepted by both the board and the nomination committee members was the chair of the board.
And I think that is so wrong.
It's so wrong.
It is destructive for that committee. No wonder it's a poor cousin.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, why do that? Well, because unless the chair has okayed not only this decision, but the process, we won't get the people that we want in. And if the chair has not okayed the risk process, then we will never face up to the risks we've got to face. And therein lies the conundrum.
And the problem you've got with the chair is they're a busy person. They're not compliance and process orientated. Having them on the committee is great because they need to influence what their board looks like. But don't ask them to do the work. It needs to be done, and in my view, led by the company secretary, who is the most appropriate person aligned to the chair that they can trust, will get the process to move along its cogs and get to its end outcome, which is putting 3 competent, decent, well-matched, well-aligned people in front of the chair and whoever else is doing the final interviews.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Anyway, we are now on time. I feel really embarrassed that we have to stop at such a lovely conversation that we're having. We have covered most of the questions. There's just one question on what is the tolerance for ambiguity. It sits within our appetite quotient, is the ability to accept VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, those kind of things, ambiguity being one of them. We are not high as humans on being able to do that. So this is where our appetite quotient really kicks in and defines how some people just can't widen their mind beyond certain parameters. So thank you very much, Andrew. I really appreciate the time, the insights, and the degree of research evidence that you bring with your insights is amazing. Thank you so much. I look forward to picking up with you again. And to the audience, thank you very much for spending time here with us today. And we look forward to the next session where we will build upon some of the issues that the boardroom has to deal with at a boardroom dynamics and a governance aspect. There are so many topics to share. So I look forward to carrying on talking to interesting people in the industry as we've done today. Andrew, thank you.
My greatest pleasure. Thank you. All the best with the current series.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye.
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 For those that are still with us, if you want to take down any telephone numbers, contact points, they are on the screen at the moment. There is a QR code as well.